17th century, Presbyterians were forced to worship away from towns and villages, where they would be arrested for practicing their faith.
Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven.
Scots died in battle and were executed in the struggle to keep their country Calvinist. Copies of the National Covenant, drawn up to protect Presbyterianism, were sent throughout Scotland. James Graham, 5th Earl of Montrose, was the driving force behind the movement.
He had been educated both in Glasgow and at St Andrews. He also studied at the military school at Angers in France, where he paid particular attention to the tactics of Gustavus Adolphus.
Charles I knew he would have to use force against the Scots and played for time. In 1638, he allowed a General Assembly of the Church of Scotland to meet in Glasgow Cathedral. The Marquis of Hamilton was sent north to act as the King's representative.
He was sent up with, I think, the impossible job of reconciling the Covenanters to King Charles I and his religious plans, which was oil and water, really.
The General Assembly deposed Charles's bishops and threw out the King's prayer book.
At this point, Hamilton dissolved the Assembly, and they refused to dissolve, and they continued to sit. So Hamilton got up and walked out, but he found that the door had been locked behind him, so his men-at-arms had to hack it down with their halberds.
Charles replied with force, sent Hamilton north again with a fleet.
His mother rode over from Hamilton with a couple of pistols, and it said silver balls, cast specially, and said that if her son set foot on Scottish soil against the Covenanters in anger, she personally would shoot him.
Charles made peace with the Covenanters, promising he would come to Scotland, attend the estates, and a General Assembly. When he broke his word, the Scots invaded England. The Covenanters had first-class soldiers, like the Earl of Crawford and his family.
There were 7 cousins, of whom 6 were in fact professional soldiers, either serving in Sweden, if they were Protestant, or in Austria, or in Spain, in the Spanish armies. The great cause to them, I think, was the 30 Years' War. This was the great fight between Catholicism and Protestantism, and that was a noble issue in their eyes and gave a lot of experience and a lot of employment in a rather horrific war on the continent of Europe.
Charles was forced to summon his English Parliament to get money to fight the Scots. The Covenanters, meanwhile, fell foul of each other. The Earl of Argyll, head of Clan Campbell, was a staunch Calvinist. He talked of deposing Charles I. Montrose felt the Covenanters were going too far.
He was asked to sign a band which was going to appoint Argyll, Mar and Cassilis to be the 3 rulers of Scotland. And this confirmed his worst fears of the attitude of the Covenanters to the monarchy. And so immediately he withdrew to Cumbernauld and met there with a group of the moderate Covenanters, and they pledged themselves together to, as they put it, to protect the safety of religion, laws and liberties of this poor kingdom.
August 1642, Charles I raised his standard at Nottingham, having alienated his English Parliament as well as the Scots. The Civil War had begun. The English House of Commons called upon the Scots Covenanters for help. a solemn league and covenant was signed whereby England's Puritan Church would be brought into line with that of covenanting Scotland. Montrose disliked the treaty.
He felt, having 5 years before signed the covenant which was to prevent an English king forcing Episcopalianism on the Scots, he probably didn't think very much of the Solemn League and Covenant whose purpose was to force Presbyterianism on the English.
Under Oliver Cromwell, the army of the English Parliament became a force to be reckoned with. By 1644, King Charles seemed doomed. Only news of the campaign in Scotland gave the king heart. Graham, created Marquis of Montrose, conducted one of the most remarkable campaigns in military history.
His genius was in recognizing how to use this band of Highlanders who were not used to military discipline, but who were expert at moving across the roughest of country, having practically no baggage or anything to slow them down, living off the country and attacking with great ferocity, at the crucial moment.
In September, Montrose faced the Covenanters at Tippermuir and won the first of many dazzling victories. In winter, he took his army across the backbone of Scotland. Argyll believed his men would pick the frozen, starving royalists off at leisure. It was not to be. By early 1645, Montrose was bearing down on Argyll's army. At Inverlochy Castle, Argyll was routed. 1,500 Covenanter troops were killed. Montrose lost less than 10 men. Success followed success. At Aldern, Montrose's army killed and wounded another 2,000. At Afford, 2 months later, he was again victorious. At Cosaith, Montrose cut Argyll's new army in half. He entered Scotland's capital in triumph. But his fickle Highland army could not hold the nation for his king. At Philip Hall, a heavy defeat put paid to Montrose's glorious year. Charles I, meanwhile, had surrendered to the Scots at Newark in England and commanded Montrose stop fighting. Disillusioned, he obeyed his king.
He negotiated the arrangements for the disbandment of his army and the safety of his own men, and then he and a few of the leaders took a ship and went to Norway.
The following year, the king was tried by his English Parliament and executed in Whitehall on the 30th of January, 1649. In exile, Montrose was shocked.
Montrose fell on the ground as if in a faint and then wasn't seen for 2 days, and certainly during that time he wrote an impassioned poem saying that he would avenge his sovereign's death in blood and wounds. He then is supposed to have reappeared in a suit of black armor.
In Scotland, Argyll, who had once talked of abolishing monarchy, now approached the young heir to the throne in the hope that he could manage Britain's new king. But Charles II, like his father, was a double dealer. While negotiating with Argyll and the Covenanters, he allowed Montrose to return to Scotland and campaign on his behalf. From the Orkneys, Montrose and 1,500 men crossed to the mainland. At Carbisdale, his army was cut to pieces. Montrose was taken to Edinburgh.
He then was put on a cart and driven up the Royal Mile, where the crowds had been pressed out with the intention that they should boo and, no doubt, assault him in any way they saw fit. And the striking thing about it was that when he actually appeared, there was nothing but silence.
The mob shed tears as Montrose made a short speech.
I go to heaven's throne with joy, and he suffers me not to fear the terrors of death, and furnishes me with confidence and courage to embrace it even in its ugliest shape. I desire your charity and prayers. I shall pray for you all. I leave my soul to God, my service to my prince, my goodwill to my friends, and my name and charity to you all.
Argyll persuaded Charles to return to Scotland. On the 1st of January, 1651, he was crowned at Scone.
The coronation was really, I think, not only freezing cold, but extremely embarrassing and very boring, because the moderator of the Church of Scotland gave an extremely long sermon. He also interjected throughout the ceremony against monarchy in general and against Charles II in particular.
The charade of Charles II, the Covenanted King, was short-lived. The King's Scottish army at Dunbar was heavily defeated by Oliver Cromwell. Gone was Argyll's hope that he could manage his new king, become the most powerful man in Scotland. When Charles II was forced into exile, Cromwell's army set about subduing the Scots. The campaign was short, sharp, and not without incident. Sir Ewan Cameron of Lochiel was almost killed in a hand-to-hand fight with one of Cromwell's soldiers.
So the English captain was kneeling on him, and Sir Ewan couldn't move at all, and the English captain was just reaching to get his knife or pistol to finish him off. And the only thing Sir Ewan could move was his head, so he stretched up his head, and he bit out the Englishman's throat, and he held on till he was dead. And he said it was the sweetest bite he'd ever tasted.
Cromwell garrisoned Scotland and was hated.
The Scots were very well used to being abused by all and sundry. But if they were going to be abused, which they were in those days, they would rather be abused by Scotsmen than these damned English.
To the relief of many, Cromwell died on the 3rd of September, 1658, 8 years to the day since the defeat of the Scots at Dunbar.
By the sinner! Quick!
General Monk, Commander-in-Chief of Cromwell's army in Scotland, then changed the course of history. Accompanied by the Coldstream Guards, he invaded England to restore the monarchy. Monk, who had once fought for Charles I, again changed sides and helped the Stuarts regain the throne. Charles II was not a religious fanatic, and Scots hoped that strife was now at an end. It was not to be so. The King's English advisers wanted rid of Argyll. He was arrested, imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle, and convicted of having worked with the Cromwellians. He spent his last hours sleeping in his cell and faced death with resignation. Argyll, like Montrose, is buried in St. Giles. Both died as martyrs to the House of Stuart. Restored to the throne, Charles never visited Scotland again. The Earl of Lauderdale, a London Scot, was made Scottish Secretary.
He found Scotland in a terrible condition. It had been under alien military occupation for 9 years, and his concern was tranquility and reconciliation.
Like his father, Charles II wanted bishops to control the Scottish Church, bind the two kingdoms together. Under Over 300 refused and were forced out.
Theirs was the cause of humanity, and we honor the heroism
Conventicles,
of men and women.
illegal services, became numerous and popular. Severe efforts were made to crush them. Covenanters were goaded into rebellion. They marched to Rullion Green outside Edinburgh. There they were routed by the government army of General Tam Dalyell, but the king's man ordered charity.
He gave quarter, that's mercy, to, I think, some 30 women and children who were following the Covenanting forces. But they were put to the sword, as the Dalyell family history has it, on the orders of Lord Lauderdale.
He was in London as Secretary of State, so that the control was a very remote one. And the fact is that whoever was the High Commissioner at the time was in charge. And so I frankly exonerate Lord Daphne. It was not his line at all.
In Edinburgh's grass market, Covenanters hanged. General Dalyell was disgusted.
He deeply resented the fact that his orders had been countermanded, and said if this was going to happen, he would resign his commission. And I like the guy, because he resigned his commission on a matter of humane principle.
In 1669, Lauderdale granted indulgences, tried to bring the Covenanters back into the church. Most ministers refused and were rounded up with their congregations. On the Bass Rock, a special prison was built for Covenanters. Others were held in Blackness Castle. Those still at freedom took revenge. Archbishop Sharp of St. Andrews, once a Covenanter himself, was brutally murdered. His daughter watched as the old man was hacked to pieces. At Drumclog, the Covenanters went on to defeat the King's army, led by John Graham of Claverhouse. Three weeks later, an army led by the Duke of Monmouth, Charles II's illegitimate son, won sweet revenge. At Bothwell Brig, the Covenanters' army was mowed down and nearly 1,200 prisoners taken. They were herded into an improvised camp near Greyfriars in Edinburgh, where the National Covenant had been signed over 40 years before. Within 2 months, most had pledged never again to take up arms. The unrepentant continued to be persecuted. The king raised an army of 6,000 who slaughtered and pillaged at will. The 1680s were known as the killing time. Southwest Scotland, scarred by the graves of those who perished. John Nisbet from Ayrshire went to the scaffold praising the Lord. James White, shot dead by dragoons who cut off his head and played football with it. Margaret McLaughlin and Margaret Wilson were martyrs at Wigton. Tied to this stake, they were drowned by the rising tide.
The state really wanted conformity. They wanted to be assured that they were able to control the whole country. There is a sense in which this goes back to the Reformation, where you'll remember that Elizabeth Tudor was seen as the Protestant Constantine, and she was going to bring about a Protestant empire. And in a sense, the English were influencing Scotland so that Scotland was going to become part of this great Protestant empire. And if people didn't conform, they would be made to conform, because this was part of the power structure over against the things that were happening as a result of the Counter-Reformation and so on.
At Sanquhar, Richard Cameron openly declared war on the king. Charles II put a price on his head. On the 22nd of July, 1680, Cameron was killed by government troops, but his followers, Cameronians, continued the struggle. They became more extreme, advocating the overthrow of monarchy. Kirk and Covenant were one.
We do declare that we shall set up over ourselves and over what God shall give us power of, government and govern us according to the word of God, that we shall no more commit the government of ourselves and the making of laws for us to any one single person or lineal successor. This kind of government by a single person being most liable to inconveniences and aptest to degenerate into tyranny, as sad and long experience has taught us.
But most Scots were not prepared to be religious martyrs. Few wished the Stuart monarchy, however inept, to be done away with.
It's clear that there are a lot of people thinking around that time of new ways of doing things, but it just didn't appeal to the vast majority because they were still seeing a paternalistically controlled society.
James Renwick, aged 26, was the last martyr, executed in 1688. The end to the killing time came in an unexpected way. James VII and II succeeded his brother Charles as king in 1685. A Roman Catholic, his bitter controversies with his English subjects forced him to quit the country. His daughter Mary and her Dutch husband, William, were asked by the English Parliament to rule. In England, the revolution was almost bloodless, and people called it glorious. In Scotland, it was a different story. The Scots also accepted William and Mary, but on condition that they upheld Calvinism as Scotland's faith.
The grace of the Lord Jesus Christ.
With the Kirk restored, many Episcopalians were now deprived of their congregations.
Be with you all.
Some became Jacobites, supporters of the deposed King James. In the Highlands, John Graham of Claverhouse raised the standard of the exiled king in 1689. At Killiecrankie, he faced the government forces of General Mackay.
Claverhouse ordered all the clans in order and separately to charge, and they completely routed General Mackay's army. Unfortunately, consistent with his practice of being seen to be in the thick of it, Claverhouse insisted on being at the front of the section of the charge, and he himself was killed.
Without their leader, the Highlanders marched south. The Cameronians formed a regiment at Douglas Dale and marched north to halt their advance at Dunkeld. The Highlanders attacked the town. The Cameronians held their ground and the Jacobites were forced to retreat to the hills. Dunkeld, for the time being, put paid to the threat from the exiled House of Stuart. Scotland was at peace at last. The meddling of Stuart monarchs, bent on their brand of religious conformity, had brought decades of misery. The Scots would now be ruled by a monarch, not only distant, but foreign. Many would grow to hate the Dutchman William. Even more than the House of Stuart, the Scots had helped to depose.